Welcome to the screencast presentation, Wildcat Lake Ranger Station's Unique Legacy. This is a collaboration between the Manitowish Waters Historical Society, Marshfield High School Agricultural Department, and the Wisconsin Forestry History Association. This presentation was created and narrated by Jim Bokern. Three important takeaways from this presentation include: first, the evolution of state forest management, outreach, and goals. Secondly, the impact of the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station in promoting early forestry outreach to agricultural communities. And finally, number three, how Northwoods' experiences on state forest help shape agricultural practices and education in Wisconsin. If you look at the images on the first slide, the center image shows the location of Wildcat Lake Ranger Station, right next to the modern boat landing and just north of Boulder Junction on County M. The image on the right is a modern image showing the view from the terrace overlooking Wildcat Lake where the ranger station was sited. And on the far left is a historic map illustrating that at the end of the road following the railroad marked in red, the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station operated from about 1914 to about 1940. This 1885 map illustrates the intentions of the state legislature from 1878 that a state park would be created in Vilas and parts of Iron County to really give Wisconsin residents and visitors a pristine park experience to show what the Northwoods was truly like. Unfortunately, the state park was opened up to logging in 1889, and afterwards, Wisconsin became more interested in taking an active role in preserving state forests. In 1904, E.M. Griffith became Wisconsin's first state forester, and in the Forest Reserves Act of 1905, he was given control over state lands from an area around Taylor County, or Township 33, all the way to the northern borders of Wisconsin. Griffith proved to be a gifted leader, visionary, analytic, and collaborative, creating partnerships with Governor La Follette, Charles Van Hughes from the UW Madison, and even lumber baron Frederick Weyerhaeuser. As Griffith came to lead the forestry effort early on, he set three primary goals. One, to maintain the forests on the headwaters of our important rivers, the former state park, now the Forest Reserve. Second, to provide raw materials for wood industries, helping the wood industries grow in Wisconsin. And third, to make an attractive resort region, like in places that he had visited in New York. In the Department of Forestry minutes from 1910, Griffith reveals that a large holding of the Department of Forestry was difficult to manage. Both forestry and agricultural lands were subject to trespass. Griffith believed that all agricultural lands should be sold to farming interests, and only the lands most appropriate to forestry should be turned into the Forest Reserve. Griffith, by 1911, revealed his centralized model of forestry, selling the farmlands that are in the surrounding counties to consolidate the land in the Forest Reserve, marked by the highlighted area on the image on the right. To oversee this, he created a headquarters at Big Trout Lake, marked by the green arrow, and initially had 4 ranger cabins that were satellites of the Trout Lake headquarters that would conduct the business of forestry. Here you see the image of the headquarters at Big Trout Lake, and each of the 4 original ranger stations listed, from Little Car Lake near Lake Tomahawk, Rest Lake in Manitowish Waters, Boulder Dam Lake by Highway K and H near Boulder Junction, and Plum Lake, located on the central part of Plum Lake along the northern shores where water ski shows are conducted today. Forest rangers and work crews, illustrated here on the left, began in 1912 to start carrying out the business of Griffith's vision of modern forestry. To the right, you'll see a windmill tower with a phone at the base of it on the left that would communicate fires and other dangers back to headquarters to create fast responses to challenges throughout the forest. During the same time, a strong agricultural influence was also emerging in the Northwoods. Their goal was to move from the axe to the plow and not really promote a large forest reserve. The first, UW Extension Agricultural Agent E.L. Luther, started in Oneida County and had an alternate view. Luther is on the image to the right. He accused Griffith of creating a playground for the rich in the forest reserve, and others supporting Luther's vision actually bragged that northern Wisconsin would be another dairy region on par with Dane County near Madison. A conflict between the use of the land by these two special interests are going to continue. The solution to this problem, as advanced by the state of Wisconsin, was to create a special legislative committee on forestry. This document is extensive and well researched. In the slide, you can see the 33 different recommendations from the committee that were seemingly bipartisan and insightful, trying to bring a resolution and moving the goals of forestry forward. What happens between 1914 and 1915, the state Supreme Court steps in, removing any hope of compromise. They end the Department of Forestry by judging it to be unconstitutional because it was implied that creating a state forest was something like building a canal and was not supposed to be taken up by government interests. They believed that was part of the private sector. So the Department of Forestry goes through dramatic changes, and Griffith leaves the department in 1915. Between 1913 and 1914, the forester reports from E.M. Griffith were purged, causing historians and researchers a real gap in understanding of what was happening under Griffith's plan. With this purging of information, we really only get insights into what Griffith was trying to accomplish by looking at the reports from 1915 and 1916. As we do, we see that Griffith was really quite busy. As you look at the right, we'll see that in the green arrows, Star Lake Ranger Station, Carroll Lake Ranger Station, and the Flambeau Lookout Tower were all built, as well as the topic of this presentation, the red arrow, the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station. 4 patrol cabins were part of this growing centralized model to create outreach by rangers, patrolmen, and workers for the forest reserve. And at the very bottom, you see 4 auxiliary lookout towers to create that network of communication to suppress the fires that had plagued the Northwoods since the cutover. DNR documents reveal that the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station had not only a ranger cabin, but a barn, a men's cabin for the crew, a woodshed, and an ice house. As we look at aerial photos from 1937, the blue arrow and the image on the left actually shows the ranger cabin in operation. Please also take note of the large cleared campus that is around Wildcat Lake Ranger Station. The lower right image is a picture of ranger stations that were built throughout the forest reserve, matching the image on the left well. And in the upper right, we see again another image illustrating the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station with the yellow arrow right at where the modern and historic boat landing for Wildcat Lake exists. Ultimately, the Forest Reserve region experienced reductions of manpower and a decentralization of forest rangers, patrolmen, and workers. You can see the map on the right is quite a bit different than the map shared earlier by Griffith that had a network of ranger stations and towers. 1917 to 18, we see that the new Wisconsin Department of Forestry, which folded in all former natural resources groups like fisheries, forestry, parks into one organization. Under the Wisconsin of Forestry, now under the umbrella of the Wisconsin Conservation Commission, we see 5 different fire districts are created as part of this decentralization. Please note the exclusion of Vilas and Oneida counties, which were operating under the Old Forest Reserve. By 1925 to 1926, decentralization continues with 11 different protective districts. One of the great insights that we get regarding the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station comes from an interesting book entitled Northwoods Life Growing Up at State House. John Christensen, the son of longtime forest ranger at Big Trout Lake, has written down many vignettes and stories that allows us to see into the earliest times within the Forest Reserve. First, he says he can't remember anyone staying at rest in Wildcat Lake because of this decentralization. But after having a gruesome cleanup duty to get a dead rabbit out of the basement of the Wildcat Ranger Station, he commented on how beautiful the view was off the front porch, looking over Wildcat Lake, and how much he prized that particular area, and that the ranger station was at the end of the road. The image on the left from 1914 in the yellow arrow confirms the observations of Christensen and gives us some insights into the beauty, the location, and the promise of this ranger station. Seemingly, the Wildcat Ranger Station was destined to become a casualty of partisan politics within Wisconsin and ideological battles. But a curious thing occurred. If you look at the image at the left, the 4-H clubs started to emerge throughout the United States. And to the right, there was also an emergence of a movement of school forest. Interestingly, Wisconsin emerges as a leader in forestry and environmental education. And then, ironically, the agricultural community that largely tried to end Griffith's vision of forestry will begin to re-engage and proactively shape generations of children and adults to become stewards of natural resources. As we follow this thread, early on in 1925, as 4-H emerged out of diverse grassroots vocational agricultural groups in the nation, we see the Wisconsin Library Bulletin reports campfire talks in the Upper Dells and on the Cedar River, using a camp-like model to extend the goals of the 4-H and the agricultural community. The forest worker, talking about state forestry, began to engage in a new model of forestry clubs for the 4-H. Many of the 4-H practices were formed into clubs, and Wisconsin became part of the second wave of 4-H clubs in 1926. At that time, the College of Agriculture at the University of Wisconsin hired a new general agricultural club leader to free up Wakelin McNeel, a rising star in education, forestry, and environmental stewardship. McNeel had a vision of a junior forest ranger project that he wanted to advance throughout the state of Wisconsin. It was unique to Wisconsin. Starting in 1927, creating a network of 4-H groups to advance forestry throughout the state, he then reached out to what is now the Northern Highland Forest and the Wisconsin Conservation Commission and Extension Foresters to create a summer camp experience as a capstone for these young junior forest rangers. And what was available was Wildcat Lake Ranger Station for the destination. By 1929, Wisconsin becomes recognized as a national leader in this movement. We'll witness that the forestry clubs for young people was part of the United States Department of Agricultural movement at this point. And within Wisconsin, the junior forest rangers developed one of the most robust curriculums in the country. McNeel's fingerprints are all over this curriculum, as demonstrated in the table below. A 4-year curriculum, tiered with specific activities. The green arrow on the right, when the 4th year you achieve the rank of cruiser, firefighting was even part of the possibilities for these young men and women within the state of Wisconsin. This model and McNeel's talent and tenacity will make a huge difference throughout the state of Wisconsin. So much so that Ranger Mac, that he's known as because of the Junior Forest Ranger program, will be inducted to the 4-H Hall of Fame, one of numerous honorary titles that Wakelin McNeel will hold throughout his tenure as an educational leader. As we start to review the documentation within the state to better understand the junior forestry program and the role of the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station, we see that early on in 1928, local rangers, extension rangers, were actively working with the Junior Forest Ranger program. Fred Wilson supported Ranger Mac and his Junior Forest Rangers with buildings and equipment for 68 boys from 13 counties. In 1929 to 1930, we witnessed that the Junior Ranger Forest program and the camp on Wildcat Lake continued to prosper. Please note the green highlighted line in the document on the right that the Commission supplied free seedlings for forest planting to these boys, likely starting as early as 1928. This will be critical to the long-term impact of the camp, the collaboration with the foresters and the extension foresters, and the development of forestry and agricultural practices within the state of Wisconsin. In the Extension Forester from June 1930, Fred Wilson writes extensively about the camp on Wildcat Lake for the 4-Hers. We're going to break this document down into several slides and examine it as it reveals the operation of the camp, the intent, and ultimately its long-term importance. Initially, Wilson talks about a perfect collaboration, and I quote, capturing and holding the imagination and enthusiasm of the youth of America in an effort to create a forest-minded generation is an indispensable part of a forest conservation program. As a part of the extension work, this is done through the junior forest ranger clubs and schools. Wilson further goes on to talk about Ranger Mac. The leader of the junior forest rangers took 13 such hikes, each involving a day or two. This is revealing of how the hands-on approach to learning forestry was the cornerstone for Wakelin McNeel. To the left, one of the more famous trails in the Northern Highland American Legion Forest, in full fall colors, part of the Escanaba Trail between the parking lot and Trout Lake. Additionally, if 13 one- or two-day hikes are being conducted by the mentor, Ranger Mac, these camps had to last 2.5 to 3 weeks, giving us some insight to the duration of the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station 4-H camp. The next item from Wilson's report is the Junior Forest Ranger School is held annually at Wildcat Lake, and as many as 63 boys from 13 different counties would be present. Here you see an aerial photo with a yellow arrow showing that high terrace that Christensen described that overlooked Wildcat Lake, a perfect site for a ranger station and now a 4-H camp. Importantly, Wilson talks about how the experiences in the woods of northern Wisconsin were then migrated down to the areas of southern Wisconsin. And in places like Russ County, we'll see that forestry exhibits and projects are going to be advanced. The image above shows that the junior forest rangers followed up on these projects when they went back to their communities. The Wildcat Lake Ranger Station summer camp for 4-H was not a one and done experience. As outlined by Ranger Mac, it is a 4-year experience with a progression of skills and accomplishments that were monitored locally. By 1931, there was a change in the state forester extension leadership. Wakelin McNeel was joined by Frank Trenk, the new state extension forester, who will be a great and enthusiastic partner for McNeel's vision. Trenk, after replacing Wilson, will co-author the School Forest Handbook, as seen on the right, with McNeel. Trenk also created the Forestry Planting Handbook for the Conservation Department. The practices in this handbook become key linkages to the 4-H community and practices on farms and woodlots throughout Wisconsin. Within a short period of time, the junior forest rangers will be marked as fire prevention leaders, and oftentimes the State Commission on Conservation and the Extension Foresters would do seminars and educational programs to advance their goals on maintaining quality forests. The Forestry Worker magazine of 1932 made two critical observations regarding the progress of Wisconsin's forestry models. First, that these activities in the 4-H forestry clubs would include the planting of windbreaks and shelter belts. You may recall that I pointed out with green text early on under Fred Wilson that the Department of Forestry was sharing seedlings with these 4-Hers. Those seedlings migrated across Wisconsin through these 4-H clubs and were planted in windbreaks and shelter belts which will prove to be critical in the long term. Secondly, Wisconsin was also noted for leading the way in school forests. We saw the handbook that was later produced by Ranger Mack and Trenk that'll be very, very important in continuing the traditions that started at Leona School Forest. The school forest movement was started by Russell, but as we see from the Madison, Wisconsin forestry website, McNeel and Fred Trenk supercharged this effort. McNeel continued his meteoric rise as a leader in education, environmentalism, and in particular in forestry. He began to run a famous radio show using the technology of the time called A Field with Ranger Mack. On the lower left, you see Ranger Mack conducting a radio show. Hundreds of thousands of Wisconsin youths and adults tuned in and learned about the practices of forestry, elevating the forestry models throughout the state and throughout the schools. The Wildcat Lake Ranger Station summer camp and the development of the junior forest rangers continued to grow from 1928 into the 1930s. Logically, as the grip of the Great Depression tightened on America and agricultural communities struggled, many of the older junior forest rangers likely opted out to engage in the federal program of FDR's Tree Army, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Parallel in their mission, farm families would be more inclined to send sons 18 years and older to the CCC camps because at least $20 of their $25 enrollees made each month would be sent home to families needing relief. If you look to the right, research by the Manitowish Waters Historical Society has created this Google map illustrating communities where enrollees came from around the state to try to advance the goals of the state forest on the banks of the Manitowish waters. Camp Mercer was important, and it really showed how farm families and the children of farm families produce great enrollees to continue Ranger Mack's vision under federal leadership. And again, the state forest rangers are there to support environmental best practices. By 1936 and 35, the junior forest rangers were expanded and actually added to fire prevention throughout the state of Wisconsin. 50 junior forest rangers were part of these effective protection plans. As stated earlier, in this point of the Great Depression, these would logically have been young men and possibly young women that would be in the ages of 15, 16, and 17. Perhaps a bit older, but many of those men, again, might have been engaged in the CCC programs. Documents from 1934 through 1936 illustrates the evolution of the Junior Forest Ranger program. First, on the lower left, from the Wisconsin collections, a 1934 image illustrates during the Great Depression, both adults and young men seemingly are in the field in the southern part of the state getting instruction on the Junior Forest Ranger program. In 1935, on the right-hand side, we see more evidence that the Junior Forest Ranger program was still operating in the Northern Highland American Legion Forest, as the Junior Forest Rangers are inspecting trees that are older growth in the forest reserve. The transition is going to begin to a new 4-H forestry experience within Wisconsin Dells. One of the more interesting discoveries in the research was an interview recorded at the Wisconsin Historical Society in 1961 with Frank Trenk. He was being interviewed about his shelter belt initiative in farm areas throughout the state, and the interviewer inquired whether he had any opposition to this new forestry model and its impacts on agriculture. There had been some history of friction between these two groups. Trenk responded quickly, indicating that Fred Wilson, the extension forester before him, had established a few demonstration plots geographically in sandy soils to create shelter belts. If you would recall, back in 1928 through 1930, under Wilson, the 4-Hers were given seedlings, and they were part of these projects that were followed up back within the communities of the young men who were attending the Wildcat Lake summer camp. Those, logically, make up a good portion of the shelter belts that had grown up. Trenk then says, we were able to demonstrate that under these older shelter belts, they were able to grow very good alfalfa and potatoes right up to the tips of the pine limbs. This important evidence and an outcome of Ranger Mac and Fred Wilson's collaboration proves to be important in advancing shelter belts and putting farmers in Wisconsin at ease regarding the development of forests so close to their fields. Later, the Junior Forest Ranger program takes up the shelter belts efforts with enthusiasm. This document from 1939 shows the continuation of shelter belts and windbreaks. Forestries Have a Future, Frank Trenk, puts shelter belts right on the front cover of his Wisconsin River Valley publication for farm forestry and woodlots. Today, whether you drive by car or fly in an airplane across the state of Wisconsin, shelter belts, woodlots, windbreaks are all part of the familiar scenes that we enjoy today. Interestingly, some of the work done in the late 1920s prepared Wisconsinites and Wisconsin farmers to have a viable option to push back against the effects of the Dust Bowl in the Great Depression. The United States Department of Agriculture constantly looked to these 4-H clubs into the late 1930s for leadership. The conservation wildlife groups of 4-H clubs were actually showcased for creating feeding stations for upland game birds. The Upham Woods Outdoor Learning Center, which is a world-class environmental educational facility, seems to have some connections to the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station. It could be argued that the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station was formative to the development of the Upham Woods Outdoor Learning Center. Just as we discover a lack of evidence of 4-H Junior Forest Ranger camps in the Northern Highland American Legion Forest after 1935, coincidentally, in 1935, the 4-Hers moved to the Wisconsin Dells and explored the possibility of expanding their camps there. By 1941, Wakelin McNeel, Ranger Mac, becomes the superintendent of Upham Woods. At what point the new, robust, UW-sponsored facility in the Wisconsin Dells is going to be showcasing 4-H best practices at many levels, but in particular regarding forestry. The Upham Woods is a beautiful area within the Dell system, surrounded by water. It allowed numerous experiences in closer proximity to many of the farming communities. Fundraising was successful, buildings were put on the site, and today it is a showpiece for the state of Wisconsin. McNeel's work and his recognition as Ranger Mac saw him recognized by the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame, as well as by Wisconsin Society of American Foresters in their Hall of Fame. And as you may recall, he is in the 4-H Hall of Fame too. His work and contributions, working first in a grassroots way within communities, a small summer camp that he ran off of Wildcat Lake for 7 years, and then really leading the development of a world-class 4-H environmental camp experience at Upham Woods. Interestingly, in the research, some locals have argued that Wildcat Lake had a fire tower that was associated with the ranger station. Research is ongoing, but this 1937 fire protection map accurately illustrates the location of known fire towers, and there is no fire tower located in the area around Wildcat Lake. So if there were a fire tower there, it probably did not operate concurrently with the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station. The last citation we have on the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station is from 1939, when geologists were doing analysis of water and core samples. They explored the well at Wildcat Lake Ranger Station. Probably the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station suffered the same fate of the Civilian Conservation Corps as the United States prepared to fight the Axis powers in World War II. Men and resources were being diverted to save democracy. Interestingly, as Wildcat Lake Ranger Station began to fade, just 18 miles away on Jag Lake, just southwest of Boulder Junction, the Future Farmers of America selected Jag Lake as their new state camp in 1938, continuing this thread of agricultural communities coming to the Northwoods and working cooperatively with forest rangers within what is now the Northern Highland American Legion Forest. If we explore the Jag Lake website, we can see that it was started in 1938. And in addition to the great recreational opportunities that the site offered on Jag Lake, the Conservation Commission gave great support to the FFA and would help them in the building of the camp and developing their programs. Interestingly, about the same time, the White Sand Lake CCC camp will be turned over to the Boy Scouts for the Region 7 canoe base after forest rangers had sponsored camps on both Trout Lake and Lost Canoe Lake for Boy Scouts. This is all part of the cooperation of the Wisconsin Conservation Commission and the Northern Highland American Legion Forest. So it's interesting. If you look at the image on the left, you see the first 4-H conservation camp image at Wisconsin Dells in 1935. That marks that transition in which the Northern Highland American Legion Forest participation with Ranger Mac and Extension Foresters probably migrated more toward Wisconsin Dells and the budding forestry programs along Upham Woods. But the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station enjoys a small but formative chapter in Wisconsin's forestry history, and it was consistent with the goals of the 1878 State Park and E.M. Griffith And even though it sat idle for over a decade, it became the place where children and educational leaders and forestry leaders could gather and start a curriculum and a series of projects in their own communities that help shape forestry across the state of Wisconsin. The Manitowish Waters Historical Society, Marshfield High School Agriculture Department, and the Forest History Association of Wisconsin are collaborative partners in this presentation. And we reach out to you to explore the possibilities of the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station. And there's easy access to this off of County M, just north of Boulder Junction, because a long historic boat landing still operates there. You can see on the right an historic image of that boat landing. And just down that shoreline was the location of the Wildcat Lake Ranger Station and a formative 4-H camp that ran for at least 7 years and helped shape Wisconsin forestry.